Hello and welcome. I hope you're doing well from wherever it is you're joining us. In this module, we focus on the role of central banks as lenders of last resort. For this purpose, we study several financial crises and discuss why they came about. We then consider the policy responses by central banks to these crises. We see that central banks can succeed, but that there are limits to how far they can go alone. The first crisis we look at is the Panic of 1907. This was the first major financial crisis of the 20th century. It was also the last US banking panic that occurred before the Federal Reserve System was founded. This crisis helps us understand why a central bank as the lender of last resort is needed. We then study the Great Depression. The Great Depression is another useful example because much of the present-day social safety net did not exist. Next, we take an international perspective on financial crises and identify common themes that help us identify the causes of financial crises. This big picture perspective highlights credit booms that were financed with either short-term or foreign funding and combined with investments in long-term projects or unsustainable government policies. Such credit booms foreshadowed financial crises. We reiterate the risks on relying on short-term funding by studying the US auto loan market during the 2008 financial crisis. Here, non-bank lenders relied heavily on short-term funding markets to originate auto loans. When the short-term funding markets dried up, auto sales collapsed. After all these examples, you may wonder whether credit booms always lead to financial crises and recessions. The short answer is no. As the next lesson discusses, it depends on in which sector the credit boom takes place. For example, credit booms in the manufacturing sector are often sustainable, at least historically. Having examined causes and consequences of financial crises, we then turn to the policy responses. Specifically, how can central banks counteract bank runs and sharp drops in credit supply? For this purpose, we study the responses of the Federal Reserve to the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic that illustrate the concept of the lender of last resort. That is, the Federal Reserve lends when no one else would. Monetary policy is not the only way to respond to financial crises. Fiscal policy, which involves government transfers and spending, can also help the economy. In the final lesson, we therefore discuss the fiscal response to financial crisis.